Well, good day, everyone. Welcome. Today, I wanted to continue on with our final section. And what we're dealing with here is Unit 9, where we're looking at change in the organization and how culture can help change or hinder change. So, in our first part, we looked at the organizational culture, and organization culture is really the feel of the organization. How is the organization? What are its values? What are its attitudes? How is that permeated through? Does everyone share them? And these sorts of things. Now, culture has at its core creating oneness in the organization, so that everybody thinks basically the same, feels basically the same, shares the same set of items. And the problem with that is that it kind of freezes everything. It freezes everything in a state. And the idea is that if you want to extend your culture, you need to be able to constantly drive the culture and drive the concepts of the founders and what makes the business successful. The problem with that is as times change and as events change, the organization is going to need to change. So your culture is a kind of a freezing mechanism. You need to be able to unfreeze it every once in a while and change it to accept the new norms. So what we have in this graphic right here is kind of a representation of some of the challenges with culture and the need and the recognition for the need for change. What we've got driving forces to create change. So let's say, for example, new technology comes into play. What we need to be able to do is to be innovative, accept the technology, adopt the new technology, adapt to the new technology. No different than, for example, offering online business. If you're in a pandemic, you used to have a storefront, people used to walk in the door. If they can't do that anymore, well, you need to change. And if people are very reluctant to change because there's a very strong culture of customer service face to face and these sorts of things, it could mean that your business is going to be in jeopardy. So we've got some serious driving forces that cause change to happen. We've also got some serious restraining forces that prevent it from happening. You know, everybody is comfortable with the state that they're in and they don't want to change. And the culture doesn't really allow for good change. So we've got these two opposing forces bumping up against one another. So we have to recognize that we need to get somewhere. We need to move to a desired state in order to adapt and to bring the organization forward. So the real question that organizational behavior theorists have looked at is how can we effectively do that while at the same time maintaining the benefits of a strong culture? So the first thing that we really need to look at is what are the things that necessitates this change? What are the real drivers for change? Well, first and foremost, a dramatic crisis. And I don't think we have to look any further than the situation we're currently in with the COVID pandemic to say that is a dramatic crisis. Organizations are faced with all kinds of challenges with how to do business in this environment. If you're an airline like WestJet, for example, and 95% of the customers that you used to fly no longer fly, wow, you've got a huge amount of excess capacity. And that capacity is embodied in airplanes that cost $100 million dollars a piece. And you just can't let them sit idle and think that's not going to cost me anything. They come with a cost. There's a cost in parking them, a cost of keeping them alive. The value of them is probably dropping because nobody wants to buy an airplane in this environment. So that's a dramatic crisis if I've ever seen it. Okay. And companies who are caught in this dramatic crisis, such as the airlines, have recognized over the last year that they really need to change. And so that change has been excruciatingly difficult, and it will continue to be excruciatingly difficult. We also have change that comes about because of a change in leadership. I think if we look at the United States and we look at the country down there, we had Donald Trump exit and we have Joe Biden come in. Two very diametrically opposed philosophies of how to run a country. And that change in leadership, if we have seen some fundamental shifts in the United States as an organization. If we think of the country as an organization, their approach to the COVID pandemic, their approach to how to fix the economy, their approach to taking care of people has all been fundamentally changed. And again, leadership makes that difference and happens as well in small organizations, big organizations, countries, the world. We also have young and small organizations creeping in. You know, back in 1993, nobody heard of a company called Facebook because it didn't exist. In fact, it wasn't until 1994 that we have this guy by the name of Zuckerman get really involved with creating some sort of a fancy dating app for his Harvard campus. He wanted to meet girls. But this technology evolved into what we know today as Facebook. So Mark Zuckerberg has become very rich on this. And this has been one of these young and small startup companies that has come in and fundamentally changed the groundwork of how advertising is done. You know, if you think about how we advertise now, so much advertising dollars has migrated to platforms, social media platforms, including Facebook, on the web because it works. And you know, traditional newspapers, magazines, and television has all suffered the brunt of that. And we've seen fundamental shifts in how television works. Netflix, for example. We've seen fundamental shifts in newspapers. Many have disappeared, including local ones like the Packet here in Clarenville or the Advertiser in Grand Falls, or you know, these local papers are no more community newspapers. And it's because largely of Facebook. And we also see other fanciful conditions that cause change, and that's no culture or weak culture. Organizations can change because their culture doesn't keep them as one. They don't have a strong enough culture to relate to. And this can be very burdensome for business. And we're seeing it now embodied in many businesses because as the baby boom, the people born between 1945 and 1960, those people are getting ready to retire, okay? Or they are retired. And as a new crop of people come into the workforce, the corporate memory of organizations, in other words, those people who worked in the organization for the last 30 years have all gone out and they haven't shared all the values, beliefs, and attitudes necessarily with the new group, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. But the fact is the new group probably don't have that strong culture. And this is going to mean some very strong changes in many organizations over the next number of years because the cultures are just not strong in organizations like they used to be years ago. I just wanted to look at this short video here related to this issue.
Hi, I'm Gary Hamel, professor at the London Business School and director of the Management Lab. Welcome to my video blog, Gary Tells You Why. Today I want to talk about why deep change is usually crisis-driven, why most organizations change behind the curve rather than in front of it. I mean, think about it. What does it typically take for an organization to shake loose all those old traditional beliefs, to question the fundamental assumptions that it has about what business it's in, who's the customer, how do we make money? Usually it takes some kind of valley of the shadow of death experience. This is what Nokia went through. It's what Tesco, the big British retailer, has gone through recently. Just about every company, this is how change happens. And typically, at some point, the board wakes itself from the slumber, and usually, like too late, but ultimately, they replace the management team. In other words, deep change takes a coup. We decapitate the old leadership team, put in a new team, and that team's first priority is a big strategy review and set the organization on a new direction. In fact, if you didn't know better, you think that when it comes to change, organizations benchmark poorly governed third world dictatorships. Because change in the average global 1,000 company happens the same way it happens in some benighted poor country in the world, some dictatorship. Change is belated, it's convulsive, and it's infrequent, right? Pressure builds and builds. The organization gets more out of sync with its environment. And then finally, the board steps in and you have a new leadership team and kind of off you go. That is really a very expensive way to change. Certainly, we can do better than that. And typically, that new CEO runs some kind of turnaround, right? They run the turnaround playbook, and we all know how that works. You start by doing a bunch of downsizing. You lower the head count, try to lower the break-even point, take some big write-offs. Then perhaps you sell off some underperforming businesses. There's some disposals. Then maybe a big acquisition to take the consolidation gains, some continuous improvement programs. But very seldom of those like turnaround programs, very seldom do they spawn entirely new businesses or even more so reinvent the core business. So most turnarounds are much more about restructuring than they are about rejuvenation. Again, we have to do better than this. We have to change the way we change. So let's think about it for a moment. Why is change so often crisis driven? Well, it has a lot to do with that old organizational pyramid, right? All those layers. Think about it. In a traditional organization, who is responsible for setting strategy and direction? Right? It's at the top of the company. It's the CEO, it's the executive team, it's the board. And then ask, where in that organization are you going to find people who have most of their emotional equity invested in the past? The people who built the old business model, who've been nurturing it and protecting it. Again, those people are at the top. You start to see the problem here. Somebody sent me a document a while ago. It came to me as a PDF, and it had been sent to 70,000 people in an organization you would know. And this document, drawn up presumably by some people in HR, down one column, it had a whole set of behaviors that they wanted people to execute, communicates openly and executes with excellence and so on. And then they had columns that represented the layers of the organization, executives, managers, individual contributors. Well, one of the behaviors they had there was think strategically. And the only kind of mark against that behavior was under the executive column. In other words, this organization was telling 99% of their associates, their team members, that you don't have to worry about the future, those emerging customer needs, those disruptive technologies, those new competitors. You don't have to concern yourself with that. Those of us in the executive suite will worry about it. We're responsible for strategy. The rest of you just get busy and do your job. Well, I tell you, it's a very bad bet based on my evidence that you can simply leave strategy up to the top team. In fact, I think the simplest explanation of why organizations ultimately go sideways or worse is that the executive team fails to write off their depreciating intellectual capital. They have a view of technology, of competitors, of customers, the industry, that has been going slowly out of date, but yet they're still in charge. And so really, if you think about it, when we concentrate the power for strategy and direction at the top, you are giving a small number of people the right to hold the organization's capacity to change hostage to their own personal willingness to adapt and change. In other words, a handful of people become the gatekeepers on organizational change, and the organization can change faster than those few individuals can learn. That is a problem in our topsy-turvy world. And I see this again and again, even in really smart companies. I think about Microsoft, right? A great company, an amazing company filled with smart people. And yet over the last several decades, Microsoft has often been late to some of the big trends in the software industry. It was late initially getting onto the web. It was late in advertising supported software and search a la Google. It was late into mobile devices, late into the cloud, just late and late again. And for much of that time, Bill Gates was not only the CEO and chairman of Microsoft, he was also the chief software architect. So if you had an idea for a fundamentally new kind of software model, whose permission would you have to get to invest and pursue that initiative? You'd have to get the permission of Bill Gates. Problem was, and this is no criticism of Bill Gates, smart guy, problem was his mental model was wrapped up in the personal computer as a personal productivity device, sold to CIOs, and every year or every few years you'd introduce a new version of Windows and try to have another round of licensing income. That was the model. And unfortunately, the world moved on. I remember back in the last century, literally in 1999, I was giving a talk at Microsoft, and I talked about the post-PC world, what comes after the personal computer. And at a break, somebody came up to me and said, Gary, at Microsoft, we don't talk about the post-PC world. We talk about the PC plus world. I said, well, that's great, but guess what? The future is not always an extrapolation of the past. And indeed, that became a pretty big challenge for Microsoft. And their current CEO, Satya Nadella, has kind of admitted as much. He said, for way too long, we regarded the PC as the center of everything, and it wasn't. In fact, it's interesting, in 2007, when the first iPhone came out, Microsoft's then CEO, Steve Ballmer, he went on record, 2007, as saying the iPhone would fail, it would never get any market share, and he really believed that. And it's understandable why he believed that, because if you've been selling, PCs and software, you've been selling that to CEOs and to CIOs who are very cost kind of sensitive, it's almost impossible to imagine that any company could pack $700 worth of differentiation in a small consumer device, which is what the iPhone cost, more or less. It just was outside of Steve Ballmer's frame of reference. Think about it. If we take three of the greatest innovators over the last 10 years, we took Steve Jobs, now sadly gone, Larry Page, co-founder of Google, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. Imagine for a moment that all three of those individuals had spent their careers as EVPs at Microsoft. How much of that innovation would we have seen? Not very much, because they would all been held hostage to the views of a few people at the top. So that's the challenge, my friends. If we want to build organizations that can change ahead of the curve, we are going to have to change the way we set strategy. It needs to be something that is syndicated to the entire organization. We need to hear the points of view of people out on the fringe who are not held hostage to nostalgia and denial and old ways of thinking. But no longer can we expect strategy to emerge from the top of our organizations. So change that, and you will build an organization that will forever outrun the future.
Yeah, I thought he made a very good point there. I thought he made a very good point there with regards to this idea of information being held or change being held hostage by the executive. What you have, the very few people at the top of the organization, and those people, if they're tasked with the job of setting plans and creating change, they're probably not going to, because they're probably comfortable with the current situation, as Microsoft was and as many other companies are. And until you allow people with new ideas and fresh concepts to come in, that makes change that much more difficult. So crisis sometimes brings about that change in competitors. So the competitive market certainly helps save some of the trouble that comes with this. Another thing that comes into play is leadership. And again, all of these kind of merge into one another, but here's an example of some of the challenges of mergers. We talked about acquisitions in there, and we're talking about how leaders deal with that. So just take a minute to watch this.
Robert, the end of 2020, Air Transat shareholders gave the thumbs up to the acquisition by Air Canada. Is that a foreshadowing of things to come in 2021? Will we see more acquisitions?
Yeah, for sure. If you had asked me, 6 months ago, with airlines around the world, including in Canada, parking 2/3 or more of their fleets, I would have expected to see more outright failures, more consolidation. We have seen a number of airlines go into voluntary administration, like Virgin Australia, Avianca, Colombia, LATAM, and South America. But there hasn't been a lot of outright failures. So I think the other shoe to drop, similar to the Air Canada Transat, will be more mergers and acquisitions, and we could see other plays in Canada. I can't say this specific name, but it could be possible that some mid-tier carriers might end up joining forces. But for sure, Air Canada and Transat is heralding the way forward for airlines to start to crawl out or claw out of this massive hole they found themselves in.
We saw that air cargo was very active in 2020, and there is speculation that it'll take some time for air travel to get back to normal. What is going to recover first?
I think the majority of the world's air carriers now are thinking, well, we're going to come out of COVID smaller. And the original thinking, again, 6, 7, 8 months ago was it's going to take us until 2023 or so, 3 years to recover. We're now talking about 5 years. So we're going to come back smaller. There will be some consolidation. Certainly right now, the travel that is happening, very strong in what we call the VFR, visiting friends and relatives market. So you've got a mother or relations overseas. That's the segment right now that's doing reasonably well. So we think VFR traffic will come in very strongly. There's a big pent-up demand from families that have been disconnected during the crisis. They will want to travel as soon as possible. We also think leisure travel, anybody I speak to, maybe anecdotally, talking about how they've got cabin fever. They've been used to traveling on 1 or 2 annual vacations domestically within Canada and overseas as well. So we think the leisure market will also come back very strongly.
So I won't play all that, but the fact of the matter is, I think he summarized some of the things that we're going to see in the airline industry looking forward, and how this shock and how they're going to pull out of this shock and where the markets are going to be. So airlines right now are in the process of thinking about what is the future and how are they going to adapt to it. So the leisure market, he suggests, will pick up first. And we're seeing today, in fact, as I record this today, American Airlines has said that they're going to be back to about 90% of their flight routes by June. So there's a good indication that the airlines out there now are getting ready to restart their enterprises and bring things back on. So, this sudden shift has meant that they're going to do things differently. It's going to be a smaller airline than before. But all the same, we're certainly going to see a lot of work with regards to changes in the airline industry, acquisitions in the airline industry, and these sorts of things. The other thing that we need to look at is, okay, well, if these changes happen, and in spite of strong cultures, why do they happen? So there's been a lot of research on terms of what brings about change, what drives change, and there are a couple of models here that are talked about in this section, and I think that it is good to have an understanding of them in broad. The first model that we look at is something called Lewin's 3-step change model, and this is so simplistic that anyone looking at it should be able to see it very simply. Okay, what he suggested is that companies have what's called a freezing period and an unfreezing period. Unfreezing means that the organization is open to change during that period. Something causes the thaw of an organization that makes it unfreeze. When that thaw happens, change can happen. Once a change has happened, the organization goes back into what's called a freezing mode. In other words, it's very reluctant to change. So what we do is we have these short periods of time where change can happen. Thump. Once the change has happened, then the organization solidifies again. And so in terms of this change theory, what he's really saying is that someone comes into the organization or some event happens. These people or events are called change agents, okay? People who act as catalysts and assume responsibility of managing change comes along and says, we need to change. We need things to change. So the status quo, as indicated by the bottom line here, the status quo is no longer good enough. So the driving forces towards change exceed, the force of this exceeds restraining forces. So eventually what we're going to see is movement. Movement happens. So this period right here represents the movement period. Once those changes have occurred, the restraining forces become powerful enough to stop the driving forces. In other words, we end up with this refreezing. So we have power being exerted to get employees involved in the change process. And once the change is made, the organization says, okay, that's good. We're changed. We're good now. Let's freeze up again. So that theory, as simple as it is, has been probably the one that has been most highlighted in terms of explaining why and how change happens. Something happens, a change agent, we call it. Something causes a change to happen, whether it's a person or an event. But most of the time, we're talking that it does require individuals. Maybe it's a combination of people and events that causes this thawing of the organization, a quick shift, and then plump. And it's very challenging for organizations because you can imagine that unfreezing period lasts such a short time. It requires a very quick change. And a lot of people leave the organization, or the organization may downsize, or something very fantastical will happen in the organization. Another theory, the action research, looks at what the steps of the change agent are to bring about that change. Okay, so what we're saying is, okay, that you need that change agent. What are some of the basic steps in order to make that thawing happen? What do you need to do to bring about the change? Well, first of all, someone has to diagnose the problem. That's challenging, right? The change agent has to come in, gather up what's going on, what are the problems, what are the concerns, what needs to be changed, asks a lot of questions, reviews the records, listens to the concerns, kind of synthesizes what's going on. So that's the diagnosis. Then there's an analysis. Change agent organizes the information, gathering the primary concern, problem areas, and possible actions. So looks for what can we change into. That's the analysis. What direction should we go? Then there's some feedback. The change agent shares the initial thoughts back with the employees. And the idea here is to really build the plan of action and get people to sign on to it. How are we going to make this happen? How are we going to survive this crisis? How are we going to make that necessary change? The action happens where the employees and the change agent carry out the specific actions that they've identified. In other words, we actually do what we say we need to do. And then at the end, there's an evaluation to say, did this actually work? Did it happen? So this is kind of like a typical type of setup where we diagnose a problem, we come up with some alternatives, we set some feedback onto the various alternatives, weigh them, what's best, what's not so good, do it, and then evaluate whether or not it's worked. So really, if we think about that change agent, that change agent really has to use something called appreciative inquiry. And effectively, what they got to do is discover, dream, design, and move towards a destiny. So the discover is to identify the people who really are the keys in the organization. These are just the people who have strengths. The employees, think about when the organization worked best, who they felt most satisfied, who they worked with, what they worked with. Dreaming is kind of planning, visioning of what could be the future. What do we see as possible? What is the ideal future for an organization? So this is sometimes it's called visioning as opposed to dreaming, but effectively, where do you see yourself in 5 years is really what's being asked there. Then the design phase is how are we going to achieve that, which is very much strategy. Okay, based on the dream articulations, participants focus on finding a common vision of how the organization will look and how we're going to achieve that. And the destiny, participants discuss how the organization is going to fulfill this dream as a typically write action plan to develop implementation strategies. So this process is really just thinking and then moving into doing. This guy Kotter came up with a step-by-step plan really for organizations to bring about change. First of all, he really said, look, we got to establish a sense of urgency in creating a compelling reason of why change is needed. If you look at the Newfoundland political situation right now, we know we're in a very crisis situation with regards to our financial situation. You will notice that some pundits and some politicians have been busy trying to establish a sense of urgency in bringing about some resolution to this. I'm interested to see how strong that urgency is. The election kind of turned down the temperature on the urgency, but now that the election is over, I'm thinking we're going to see over the next little while more push by politicians and analysis to say, look, we need to do something, we need to do it fast. The second step is to form a coalition of enough power to lead the change. So we need the right people. Now, we've seen, for example, the Premier has put in place the Moya Green as a committee to assess what we should do with Newfoundland's economy, what directions forward. So sometimes you put people in place, or you gather up energies of individuals to focus them on how can we resolve this problem. Then we need to create a new vision to direct the change and strategies. We saw a lot of that new vision talked about in the election, but really it's, okay, here's where the destiny is. Here's where we're headed. This is where we want to be. This is what we see our future as. And the strategies that go with it. How are we going to get there? And then we need to communicate that vision to the organization and give people the power to achieve that vision. So remove barriers to change, encourage risk-taking, creative problem solving. So basically move the organization forward. Then we plan for create a reward, short-term wins. So we need little wins to prove that things are going well. If we don't get that, people are would give up on it, because we need to see some results quickly. So little wins are good to get the results. Then we need to consolidate improvements, reassess changes, make necessary adjustments, because not everything is going to work well. So it's basically the constant monitoring to keep it up to snuff. And then we got to reinforce the changes by demonstrating a relationship between new behaviors and the success. Regardless of how we bring about change, there are going to be people who do not like change. That is normal in organizations. So what can we do in order to minimize that change? Well, that resistance to change, I should say. Well, first of all, we say, well, what is it that, what is our underpinnings? Why do people resist change? Well, self-interest. I don't want to suffer here. So people worry about they're going to lose something of value if change happens. Thus, they look for their own self-interest rather than those of the total organization. It's natural. It is human nature to protect one